Presentation where we will be deep diving an introduction to vocabulary. So what is vocabulary? Vocabulary is the knowledge of words and word meanings. This knowledge continues to grow over a lifetime, so we never really reach true mastery of vocabulary, and it's gained through indirect exposure and explicit instruction. So why would we as teachers need to teach vocabulary in our classrooms? The number one reason is probably that it boosts comprehension. In fact, comprehension really can't exist without vocabulary. The extent of a learner's word knowledge has major influence on how well they comprehend what they read. To comprehend text, you have to be able to understand what you're reading. And so having that language piece is really the crucial element to that equation. Decoding plus language equals comprehension. To explicitly teach vocabulary is highly effective. Students who receive explicit vocabulary instruction develop more robust vocabulary, and they have larger breadths and more depth to their vocabulary. And lastly, vocabulary instruction closes the gap. Across all learners, there are significant vocabulary gaps, which often don't get closed over time unless there's that explicit instruction. And explicit instruction, especially early, can help prevent these gaps from widening, specifically in our low-income populations, with our multilingual learners, for our students who are on IEPs or 504s. These are really populations where we need to consider really closing that gap and giving explicit vocabulary instruction early on. So there are several forms of vocabulary. We have kind of first and foremost receptive versus productive vocabulary. So receptive is going to be anything that you're taking in, and that can be in the form of print, or it can be oral receptive vocabulary. So oral receptive vocabulary would be the things that we're hearing, right? Spoken words said aloud to us, or when someone's reading aloud to us. That would be an example of a receptive oral vocabulary. Similarly, anything that we're reading in print, right? So anytime we're reading books, magazines, newspapers, and we're understanding what we're reading, that is a form of receptive print vocabulary. On the other hand, we have productive, and this is our output, right? So anything we're speaking, the words we're using when we're talking with others, and then related to print, anything that we're writing, the words that we're using to write and communicate that way. So first and foremost, we have to kind of understand what it means to truly know a word, because this is going to be crucial when we're thinking about how we teach vocabulary to our learners, and just kind of, framing the conversation of vocabulary from a literacy standpoint. So we have kind of a scale, and your red zone is going to be really like surface level knowledge of a word, or maybe have never seen or heard the word before, right? So that's kind of like the tippy top of, we have not had exposure to this word. And then going a little bit down further on our scale, maybe we've heard the word, so we're in the orange, but we don't really know its meaning, but we're familiar with, the word on the surface level. Kind of midway down the scale, we may recognize the word in context as something having to do with X. So maybe you can't like put your finger on how you know the word or what the word truly means, but you've heard it before, and maybe have heard it within the context of something familiar. In our green zone, we know the word well, right? We can define the word, or when we're reading the word, we understand what it's intending to mean. And then in the blue, that's a rich, decontextualized knowledge of a word's meaning. So outside of kind of, using context clues or other information to get meaning from the word, we're able to kind of assess that on our own. It's a deep understanding of the vocabulary word. So similarly, there are levels of understanding of word meanings. So we have the breadth, which refers to the size of an individual's lexicon. So this is like sheer number of words that an individual may know and be able to use, right? This is like, yeah, we sort of know the word, but aren't like totally comfortable using it, all the way to that blue zone of like, yeah, I know this word, I can use it confidently. Breadth kind of includes all of those like levels of understanding of a word. Alternatively, depth is more about the richness of word knowledge. So this is really going to measure how well an individual knows the word and can use it fluently, right? So in conversation or in writing or when we're reading, we're really getting a full scope of the meaning of the word as it's used in the text. And then lastly, fluency. So fluency is going to refer to the rate at which an individual accesses the meaning of the word. And this improves with use and exposure. So, this is just like we hear a word, we understand it immediately, or we're able to, in conversation, retrieve a word to use it kind of fluidly. So assessment is very important to kind of all aspects of literacy, but vocabulary especially. And it's a tougher one to assess. So you really need to be using multiple forms of assessment. You're not really going to have one assessment that you'll be able to use on its own, mostly because, if you're truly wanting to get a sense of where a learner's vocabulary is at, then you're going to need kind of like multiple data points or multiple words or multiple kind of like modes of gathering that information. Similarly to other aspects of literacy, you want to establish a baseline with some initial assessments and screeners, and then ongoing informal assessments are going to be crucial for progress monitoring, and all of this should be used to guide your instruction. So some common vocabulary assessments out there that are really great: the core tools from the literacy library, the vocabulary screening test, the FastBridge auto reading, which includes word morphology, matching synonyms and vocabulary words, the expressive one-word picture vocab and receptive one-word picture vocab tests, and the easy CBM vocabulary assessment. But, also just kind of like informal observation of your learners and kind of gathering of information as you're providing instruction is going to be really a great form of assessment as well. So there's some key kind of components of effective vocabulary instruction, which, as previously mentioned, is super crucial for our learners. And there's kind of two ways that you're going to receive vocabulary learning, right? So one of those ways is incidental. So this is kind of like you're just out in the world experiencing language, whether that's sort of intentional, if a teacher's kind of mindfully including rich oral language in a classroom, or at home, parents are kind of being intentional about the language use in the home. But that's going to be, not super explicit and structured. It's just kind of through exposure and through experiences with language. Similarly, wide reading. So anytime students are asked to read independently, they're having exposure to all sorts of different words that may not be explicitly taught by teachers. And through teacher read alouds, students are going to be receiving words and vocabulary as they're listening to read alouds. On the other hand, there's more intentional vocabulary teaching. So this is kind of where we want to focus the rest of our presentation today, because this is really, really crucial for vocabulary skill growth. And that's going to be two kind of main categories with specific word instruction. So that's rich and robust instruction of words in text. So kind of explicit instruction around what words mean, previewing words before a class read passage, things like that. And then word learning strategies. So these are, real kind of explicit strategies to expose and learn new vocabulary words for learners, which includes use of a dictionary, morphemic analysis, contextual analysis, and cognitive awareness, which we'll get into a little bit further on. But kind of like superseding all of this is word consciousness. So just like having learners be aware of words and kind of what words mean, and curious and interested in how words work within language and within print. So some things that we're going to think about if we're intentionally teaching vocabulary, right? In order to deepen and develop vocabulary, students really should be explicitly taught words as well as these word learning strategies. So again, dictionary use, this seems, archaic at face value, but it's actually a really, really great instructional tool and strategy for learners to know. And this teaches students about multiple word meanings, right? And choosing appropriate word meanings based on context. So understanding that there are different meanings for words based on how they're used in print or in language. Morphemic analysis, this is analyzing parts of words or morphemes in order to obtain meaning. So this could be, we're thinking about roots or suffixes, prefixes, that type of thing. Contextual analysis is going to be using text around an unfamiliar word to determine possible meanings. And then word consciousness, again, is just explicitly teaching students how to be aware of words and their function in daily life. And this is going to, hopefully build some interest around learning new vocabulary and being mindful of vocabulary that they're experiencing. So vocabulary in our multilingual learners, this is going to be super, super important for our multilingual learners because it's kind of the basis of language. So for students whose first language is not English, right, vocabulary is especially important. These students have deficits often in vocabulary, and then therefore there's a reduction in comprehension when they're reading as compared to their English-speaking peers. A lot of the vocabulary that their English-speaking peers may have because of the language piece, our multilingual learners may not have that language yet. So vocabulary development for these learners should include, taking advantage of the student's first language when possible, right? If a student's first language is Spanish, there are a ton of similarities between English and Spanish, and using that to kind of develop that vocabulary and point out those commonalities. Some explicit teaching of meanings for very basic words so that there's clarity around the words that we're seeing every day and are used most often. And then some strategies such as read aloud, audio tapes, even parent involvement, just to review and provide reinforcement for those words that we're seeing often. And then just to note, when selecting words to use for multilingual learners, we need to pay attention to the words concreteness, cognate status, again, when applicable, like if you're thinking about Spanish and English, that's a really good bridge. We should be thinking about the depth of the meaning and utility. How do we use these words? Are they useful for the student to know? All right, so this is a potential activity that you could use, also a really, really helpful activity for kind of like third grade and up. And you can get more complex as you get into high school, as vocabulary is really like a lifelong process. So we're starting vocabulary work in that emergent stage, that pre-K stage, and then we're kind of, working on vocabulary throughout until a student leaves high school and is going on to their post-secondary paths. So this would be an example of something that you could use third grade and up. It's called a concept of definition map. And typically you would have students read a passage as a class or in small groups, and you're really trying to focus in on an important word and vocabulary word in that passage that really is important for the meaning of the passage, and also just could be an academic word, could be just like a word that is important for students to know. So we're going to be reading a passage about the ecosystem. And so our word for today's concept of definition map is going to be ecosystem. And I'm going to kind of put this up on the board for our class to look at. And we're going to talk through how we could use this to help us learn deeper meanings of words. So what is an ecosystem? And we're going to give this super basic but concrete definition, a working definition that we can always build on later. But for the purpose of really trying to get to the meat of the meeting, we're going to have our definition be a community of living organisms. So that's going to be an ecosystem. We'll have students read the headings and the boxes as they're coming up on the whiteboard or the computer. And then we're going to think about some examples. So Based on our reading, what are some examples of an ecosystem, which again is a community of living organisms? We could have a forest. A student might give another example of a grassland or a desert, tundra. These are all different examples of potentially types of ecosystems, where ecosystems live in these different climates. What is an ecosystem like, right? Because in order to truly understand what a word means, we have to think of some defining qualities about that word to help us kind of latch onto the meaning and then build onto it, and then relate to other words as we're coming across other words in our learning. And then a student might say, oh, it's a system where organisms are interconnected. We may talk about what interconnected means, right? Or what a system means. This is all developing their breadth a little bit more, right? A home for living and non-living things. And it's going to be a balanced network, right? All of these things kind of living cohesively together in a system, a balanced network, in different types of environments, right? So this is an example of how we would kind of frame the meaning of ecosystem in a tangible, kind of palatable way for our students. We're going to take that concept of definition map and create a definition for our class. So this, again, could be a working definition, but one that we're really all going to agree on and kind of really hit home what the ecosystem is for us in this classroom. So an ecosystem is a community of living organisms, which is what we found on our previous part of this activity. It has a system where organisms are connected, a home for living and non-living things, and a balanced network. Some types of ecosystems are forests, deserts, and grasslands. So now students have a definition. We were able to brainstorm it together. Maybe we expanded the breadth of our vocabulary along the way with some other words that are, academic specific. And then we can refer back to this as we're reading more about ecosystems in the future. So thank you very much for coming to my presentation today. I hope that you were able to gain some further knowledge about vocabulary and how we can incorporate it in our literacy instruction. Please take some time to complete the exit tickets. Feel free to ask any questions or, brainstorm ideas for more vocabulary topics. And then just some next steps to think about as you're reflecting on your own practice, determining whether there's space for more robust vocabulary instruction, what are other teachers doing, and then just more collaboration, even across content areas or grade levels around vocabulary. Thank you.